The wedding dress hit the flames before the vows were even a day old. Clara Whitfield stood in front of the townsfolk of Cedar Hollow. Her hands blistered, her jaw set, and said the words that would shame her husband forever. "I did not come here to sit in a parlor and rot. I came here to work." Behind her, the abandoned blacksmith shed groaned open its doors for the first time in years. If you've ever been told your place was smaller than your dreams, stay with me to the end. Comment your city below so I can see how far Clara's story has traveled. The letter had promised a home. It had not promised a cage. Clara Whitfield read it 7 times on the stagecoach ride from Laramie. The paper gone soft at the folds from her thumb, pressing over the same lines again and again. A respectable rancher seeking a wife of good character, capable hands, and a willing heart. There is a fine house waiting, and a parlor with a window that catches the morning sun. A parlor with a window. She had pictured it so many times that by the time the coach rattled into Cedar Hollow, Wyoming territory, she almost believed she wanted it. She did not want it. Not really. But wanting things that weren't offered to her had never done Clara Whitfield a lick of good, so she had learned a long time ago to want what she was given instead. The coach stopped hard enough to throw her forward. She caught herself against the seat, her gloved palm slapping the worn leather, and for a moment she just breathed. Outside men's voices, a dog barking somewhere, the particular hush of a town deciding whether to stare. "Cedar Hollow, miss," the driver called down. "End of the line." She stepped out into July heat that hit her like a hand across the face, dry, bright, merciless. Dust rose around her boots, and there across the rutted street stood a man who could only be Caleb Hargrove, because no other man in this god-forsaken sunburned town would be standing there with a bouquet of wildflowers clutched in a fist too big for gentleness. He was tall, taller than the letters had let her imagine, sun-browned, dark-haired, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and shoulders that filled out his one good shirt like he'd borrowed it from a smaller version of himself. He wore his hat low, but not so low she couldn't see his eyes, gray-wary, fixed on her like a man watching a storm cloud decide which direction to break. "Miss Whitfield." He said it like a question he already knew the answer to. "Mr. Hargrove." She dipped her chin. "I take it those flowers are for me." He looked down at his own fist like he'd forgotten what was in it. "Reckon they are." He held them out, stems crushed where his grip had been too tight. "Picked 'em myself. Didn't have the first idea what kind a woman like you'd favor. A woman like me." Clara took the flowers, careful not to let her fingers touch his. "You don't know the first thing about a woman like me, Mr. Hargrove. That's rather the trouble with a mail-order arrangement, isn't it?" Something flickered behind his eyes. Not offense, not quite. More like a man recalculating a fence line he'd already built. "Suppose it is." He tipped his hat, the gesture stiff, unpracticed, like courtesy was a coat he didn't wear often. "Preacher's ready when you are, ma'am. Whole town's been waitin' on this weddin' for a week now. Gossipin' more than prayin', if I'm honest." "How romantic," Clara said, and did not smile. She had not expected romance. She had stopped expecting romance the day her father's forge went cold, and the bank took the house in Harrisburg, and every suitor who'd once called on her father's daughter suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. A blacksmith's daughter with burn-scarred hands and no dowry was not a catch. She was a cautionary tale. So when the advertisement came through the church, Circular Rancher, Wyoming Territory, seeks wife, Clara had answered it the way a drowning woman grabs a rope. Not because she loved the idea of Caleb Hargrove, because she needed a life that wasn't ending. They walked to the little clapboard church at the end of the street, and Clara felt the whole town's eyes on her like hands. Women on porches, fanning themselves, whispering behind gloved palms. Men leaned against posts, chewing something, watching her walk like she was livestock at auction. A cluster of children ran alongside for half a block, staring up at her traveling dress. Too fine for this town, too plain for the one she'd left, until their mothers snapped them back. "They always like this," Clara murmured. "Small town," Caleb said. "Ain't much happens. A weddin's better than a barn fire most days. I'll try to be more entertaining than a barn fire." That earned her something close to a smile. Small, gone quick. But there. The wedding took 11 minutes. Clara counted them because counting was easier than feeling. The preacher's voice droned through vows that felt borrowed from some other woman's life. Caleb's hand, when he took hers, was rough as bark and warm as a stove, and she noticed, despite herself, the calluses ridging his palm, the old white scar crossing two knuckles, the way his thumb pressed once gently against the back of her hand, like he was trying to say something his mouth wouldn't. "You may kiss the bride." He hesitated. Actually hesitated in front of the whole congregation, like a boy asked to recite something he hadn't studied. Then he leaned down and pressed the briefest, driest kiss to her cheek instead of her mouth. A ripple of laughter went through the pews. Someone in the back, a woman's voice sharp as a slap, said, "Well, ain't that the tenderest thing you ever saw?" Clara's spine went straight as a fence post. She did not turn to see who'd said it. She had learned that trick a long time ago, too, that turning to face an insult only fed it. Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's enough, Ruth. I'm only saying what everybody's thinking, Caleb Hargrove. You went and ordered yourself a wife from a catalog like she was a plow blade." More laughter, uglier now. "Question is, whether she'll hold an edge." Clara turned then, slowly, met the woman's eyes narrow pale, delighted with her own cruelty, and said in a voice pitched to carry to the back pew without ever rising, "I imagine that depends entirely on what's cutting me, ma'am. Some things sharpen a blade, others just waste breath trying." Silence. Then from somewhere near the front, a low bark of laughter that the man tried to smother into a cough. Ruth's face went the color of a boiled ham. "Well, I never—" "No," Clara agreed pleasantly. "I don't suppose you have." Caleb was staring at her like she'd sprouted a second head. Not angry, something more like startled, the way a man looks when a horse he thought was gentle suddenly clears a fence he didn't know it could jump. "Reckon we ought to get on to the house," he said low, only for her. "Before Ruth Calloway finds her second wind. Lead the way, husband." The word tasted strange in her mouth. Foreign. She wondered how long it would take before it felt like anything at all. The Hargrove Ranch sat a mile outside town, up against the base of a mountain that turned violet in the late light. The house was small, but solid, better built than she'd expected, timber instead of sod, a real glass window catching the afternoon sun, exactly the way the letter had promised. The parlor was through the second door. Clara stood in the frame of it, while Caleb hauled her trunk in behind her, and she looked at the room he'd built for a wife he'd never met. A settee secondhand, but mended careful, the upholstery a faded rose color. A little table. A window with real curtains, sun-bleached, but someone had hemmed them by hand and badly, like a man who'd tried and tried again. A vase empty, waiting for flowers that hadn't survived the wedding. Her throat tightened in a way she hadn't expected. "You made this," she said. "Been working on it since I sent the letter." Caleb set the trunk down, straightened, rubbed the back of his neck. "Ain't much, but I figured a lady likes a place of her own, somewhere pretty, somewhere quiet." "It's lovely." And it was. It was the loveliest cage she'd ever been offered. She sat on the settee because it seemed expected, and folded her hands in her lap, and felt something in her chest constrict like a fist closing. Caleb hovered in the doorway, hat still in his hands, turning the brim around and around. "Figured you could set up in here. Sewin', readin', whatever it is you favor doin' with your time. I'll be out with the herd most days, got cattle up the north pasture needs movin' before the heat gets worse, but you won't want for nothin'. I made sure of that." "What do you favor doing with your time, Mr. Hargrove?" He blinked like the question had come from an unexpected angle. "Workin' the ranch. Same as my pa did, and his pa before him." "And what did your mother favor?" Something closed in his face, quick and final as a door. "My mother's dead, ma'am. Long time now." "I'm sorry. Ain't your fault." He set his hat on a peg by the door, the first thing she noticed that looked like it belonged to him instead of to some imagined version of domestic life. "Supper's simple. Beans, some salt pork. I ain't much of a cook, but I get by." "I can cook." Didn't figure a lady like you knew her way around a stove. Clara felt the old familiar heat rise up her neck, not embarrassment. Something closer to fury banked low and careful the way her father had taught her to bank a fire overnight, so it would still be burning come morning. A lady like me, she repeated. You keep saying that, Mr. Hargrove, like you've got a picture of me already framed and hung on the wall. I'd be obliged if you'd take it down before you know a single true thing about who I am. He studied her for a long moment. The gray of his eyes had a strange stillness to it, like water right before it either freezes or breaks. Fair enough, he said finally. Then tell me something true. Clara opened her mouth, closed it. The truth was too big to hand a stranger on the first day of a marriage neither of them had chosen out of love. The truth was, her father dead 18 months, his lungs finally giving out from 40 years of forge smoke. The truth was the ring of hammer on iron that had been the only lullaby she'd ever known, sitting on an upturned bucket in the corner of his shop, from the time she could walk, watching him shape horseshoes and hinges, and once a wedding band for a woman who never came to collect it. The truth was that she knew the weight of a hammer better than she knew the weight of a Bible, and that when the bank took everything else, she had begged, actually begged on her knees, which she had never told a living soul to keep his tools. They hadn't let her. Everything sold. Everything except the small leather roll of hand tools she'd hidden in the lining of her trunk, wrapped in her one good shawl, smuggled 2,000 miles west because she could not bear to let them go. The truth was that she had answered a mail-order advertisement not because she wanted a husband, but because she wanted desperately to not disappear. "I'm handier than I look," was what she said instead. "That's true enough for today." Caleb nodded slow, like he understood he'd been given a locked door instead of an open one, and had decided not to force it. "Then I reckon we'll get on fine, Mrs. Hargrove." Mrs. Hargrove. She turned the name over in her mind like a coin testing its weight. It didn't fit yet, but nothing ever did at first. Not until you'd worked it hot under the hammer until it bent into the shape you needed it to be. Supper was quiet. Beans and salt pork exactly as promised, eaten at a table built for a family Caleb didn't have yet. He ate fast the way men eat who are used to eating alone and quickly between chores. Clara ate slower, watching him, cataloging him, the way her father had taught her to catalog a piece of iron, before she ever put it to fire, where the weak points were, where it might crack under pressure, where it had strength nobody had bothered to test. "You've a scar," she said, nodding at his knuckles. "How'd you come by it?" He looked down at his hand like he'd forgotten it was there. "Colt, Greenbroke hadn't learned manners yet. Caught me against the rail fixin' a busted gate hinge. Split it clean open. You fixed it yourself, the hinge. Wasn't nobody else to do it." He said it plain, not boastful, just fact, the way a man states the weather. "Ranch this size, you learn to do a bit of everything, or you learn to watch things fall apart. I ain't much for watchin'." Clara felt something unfold in her chest, small and cautious as a hand opening. "No, I don't imagine you are." "What about you?" He nodded at her hands folded on the table's edge. "Ladies back east don't usually carry scars like that." She startled and pulled her hands into her lap before she could stop herself. An old reflex, the reflex of a girl who'd learned that pretty hands opened doors that working hands slammed shut. "An accident," she said. "Long ago." "Didn't look like an accident to me. Looked like burns. Old ones. The kind you get from workin' close to a fire, not fallin' into one." Clara's mouth went dry. He'd seen more than she meant to show him. "You're very observant, Mr. Hargrove. Man who don't watch close out here don't last long." He set down his fork. "I ain't askin' to pry, ma'am. Just if there's something about you that's gonna come up sideways later, I'd rather hear it plain now. Save us both the surprise." For one wild moment, Clara considered it. Considered telling him everything: the forge, her father, the tools hidden in her trunk, lining the hunger in her chest, that had never once, not for a single day of her 24 years, been satisfied by anything softer than fire and iron. Instead, she said, "I was raised by a tradesman. I know more of hard work than you'd guess looking at me in this dress. That's all I'll say tonight." Caleb studied her a long moment, gray eyes unreadable, and then nodded once, like a man accepting a trade he wasn't sure was fair, but was willing to honor anyway. "Fair enough," he said again. It seemed to be his answer for most things. Fair enough, and reckon so. The two poles a man's whole conversation could apparently orbit. That night, alone in the parlor, that was supposed to be her whole world, now Clara knelt beside her trunk and pulled back the false lining she'd sewn herself 3 days before leaving Harrisburg, her fingers shaking the entire time. The tools were there, wrapped in oilcloth, wrapped again in her mother's old shawl. A hammer small enough to be called a lady's hammer, but weighted true. Tongs. A file worn smooth in the middle from her father's grip, and after him hers. A leather apron folded so many times it had gone soft as cloth. She held the hammer in both hands and felt for the first time since the wedding like she could breathe. A parlor with a window that catches the morning sun. She looked at the window. The curtains Caleb had hemmed badly with more care than skill. The settee in faded rose. The empty vase. It was a beautiful room. It was not, and would never be, a life. She woke before dawn out of old habit. The habit her father had beaten into her before she was old enough to argue fire. Don't wait for a lady to finish her beauty sleep. Clara girl fire waits for nobody, and found the house already empty. Caleb gone to the herd. A note left on the kitchen table in handwriting that looked like it had been carved rather than written, gone to North Pasture, back by dark. There's flour if you want to bake. C.H. Clara read it twice, and then folded it and set it aside, and went looking for the barn. She found it easy enough. Every ranch had a barn, and every barn told you things about the man who ran it. This one was tidy, but tired. Tools hung in careful rows, but half of them were bent dulled, patched with wire, instead of properly mended. A wagon wheel leaned against the wall with a crack running clean through the iron rim. A plow sat rusting in the corner, one blade missing entirely, and past the barn, half swallowed by weeds, nobody had bothered to clear, stood a shed. Clara knew what it was before she even reached the door. She knew it the way she'd known as a girl whenever her father came near a fire, some old instinct rising in her blood like a dog scenting rain. A forge. Cold abandoned the chimney choked with a bird's nest, but a forge all the same, the anvil still bolted to its stump, rust-eaten but sound. The bellows hanging in tatters, a quench trough gone dry and cracked. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, heart hammering harder than any hammer she'd ever swung. "Who left you like this?" she murmured, and stepped inside. By the time Caleb rode in at dusk, dust-caked and saddle-sore exhausted in the particular way of a man who'd spent 12 hours fighting cattle that didn't want to be fought, he found his new wife standing in the doorway of the old forge shed with soot on her cheek, and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and an expression on her face he had absolutely no name for. "Ma'am." He swung down slow, eyeing her like she might be a fever dream brought on by too much sun. "What in the blazes are you doing out here?" "This shed," Clara said. "Whose was it?" "My pa's." Caleb led his horse toward the barn, and she fell into step beside him without quite deciding to. "He was handy with iron. Kept us in shoes and hinges and whatnot till he passed. Ain't nobody touched it since. I always meant to clear it out, use the space for something else, but—" He shrugged a gesture that carried more weight than the movement suggested. "Never got around to it, I guess. Felt wrong somehow. Tearing down the last thing he built." "It's not ruined," Clara said. "The bellows need replacing, and the chimney wants clearing, but the anvil's true, and the forge itself is sound stone. It could be fired again inside a week with the right hands on it." Caleb stopped walking, turned to look at her properly, the way he hadn't quite managed to since she'd stepped off the stagecoach. "How would you know a thing like that?" And there it was, the locked door rattling on its hinges, demanding to be opened, whether she was ready or not. Clara lifted her chin. Somewhere behind her ribs, her father's voice. Tell the truth about your work, Clara girl. Never once apologize for what your hands can do. Because my father was a blacksmith, she said. One of the finest in Harrisburg before the bank took everything he'd built and put him in an early grave trying to earn it back. I grew up in a forge, Mr. Hargrove. I learned to read fire before I learned to read scripture. I can shape iron the way most women shape bread dough, plain, practiced without a second thought. I did not come out here to sit in a parlor stitching samplers while your tools rust and your wagon wheels crack. I came out here because I was told there was work waiting for capable hands, and I intend to prove that mine are exactly that. Take it. Silence stretched between them long enough that a nighthawk cried somewhere up the mountain, and neither of them flinched. You're telling me, Caleb said slowly, that my wife is a blacksmith. I'm telling you that your wife knows how to be useful. Whether that frightens you is entirely your own concern. It don't frighten me. His voice had gone rough low, and something in it, not anger she realized with some surprise, but closer to wonder, made her chest go tight. It just ain't how it's done, ma'am. A woman workin' iron. Folks in town already think I'm strange for correcting Ruth Calloway at my own wedding. Clara cut in. I imagine they'll survive the shock of a woman with a hammer. It ain't about surviving the shock. It's about... He stopped, dragged a hand down his face, leaving a streak of trail dust across his jaw. Clara, folks out here, they already look sideways at a mail-order match. You start swinging a hammer in my daddy's forge, they ain't gonna see a skilled tradeswoman. They're gonna see a wife who's shamed her husband, and I got a herd to sell come fall contracts to sign. Men to do business with who won't think twice about taking their trade elsewhere if they think I can't. He caught himself. Can't what? Clara said very quietly. Can't control your own wife. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was written plain across his face in the particular shame of a man caught wanting one thing and needing another. I see, Clara said. She turned and walked back toward the house, back straight footsteps, even not one hint on her face of the way her chest had cracked clean down the middle. Clara, supper's beans again, I expect, she called back, not turning. I hope that suits you, Mr. Hargrove. It seems to suit most things around here. She did not cry that night. She had promised herself somewhere on the long stagecoach ride west that she would not cry over a life she had chosen with open eyes, however narrow the choosing had been. Instead, she sat on the edge of the too-soft bed in the room Caleb had given her, separate from his own. A courtesy she hadn't expected and didn't know what to make of, and she took her father's hammer out of its oilcloth wrapping and held it in her lap like another woman might hold a rosary. A woman working iron ain't natural, she could hear the town already saying. She'd heard versions of it her whole life. Every time she'd stood at her father's shoulder learning the weight of a strike, every time a customer had looked at her burned hands and asked, disbelieving, your daddy lets you touch the fire every time the world had tried to tell her that her gift belonged to someone else. She thought of the forge, sitting cold and abandoned, not 200 yards from where she sat now, waiting. The way it had probably waited every day since Caleb's father died for someone with the sense to see what it still was underneath the rust and the birds' nests and the neglect. Not ruined, she'd told Caleb, just waiting for the right hands. She wondered, running her thumb along the hammer's worn handle, if the same might be true of her. Morning came hot and merciless, the way it seemed to every day in this country, and Clara rose before the sun again, not out of habit this time, but out of decision. She found flour as instructed. She found lard and salt and the makings of biscuits, and she made them with efficient, practiced hands, while the kitchen filled with the smell of something almost like home. When Caleb came in from the barn, hollow-eyed from a night that had clearly slept him no better than it had slept her, he stopped in the doorway and stared at the table like it might be a trick. You cooked. You said supper was simple because you weren't much of a cook. I never claimed the same limitation. She set a plate down without meeting his eyes. Eat. You've a long day ahead, I imagine. He sat slow, still, watching her like she might vanish or explode, he hadn't decided which. He ate 3 biscuits before he spoke again. I've been thinking, he said finally, on what you told me last night. Have you? Clara did not look up from the stove. I ain't saying I've got it figured, but I've been thinking on it. He turned his coffee cup a slow half circle on the table. My daddy used to say a tool that ain't being used is a tool that's dying slow. Whole forge is just sitting there rustin'. Wheels cracked and I got no coin spare to send to town for a proper wheelwright, not with the herd needin' every dollar I can scrape for the drive. Plow's missin' a blade and plantin' season's near on us. Clara turned then, finally, and looked at him. Are you saying what I think you're saying, Mr. Hargrove? I'm sayin'. He exhaled long and rough, like the words cost him something physical to say. I'm sayin' I got more broke iron on this ranch than I got money to fix it proper. And I'm sayin' if my wife claims she can fix it herself, I'd be a damn fool, pardon my language, to turn that down out of pride alone. But, Clara heard it coming before he said it. But it stays here, on the ranch, fixin' our own tools, our own wagon, our own plow. That's one thing. Folks knowin' about it, that's another matter entire, and I'd ask you keep it quiet a while longer. Till I figure how to explain it so it don't paint us both a fool in this town. It wasn't everything. It wasn't the forge roaring back to life with the whole valley bringing their broken tools to her door, the way some reckless, hungry part of her chest had already begun imagining in the dark hours of the night. But it was a door, cracked open just barely on hinges, that had been rusted shut a long, long time. I can work with that, Clara said, for now, for Caleb studied her, something shifting behind his gray eyes. Not quite trust yet, but the first careful step toward it. You really aim to light that forge again, Mr. Hargrove? Clara set down the pan she'd been holding, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, she let herself smile, small, sharp, entirely unapologetic. I intend to light that forge before this week is through, and by the time the harvest comes, there won't be a single broken thing left on this ranch that my hands haven't made whole again. He was quiet a long moment. Then low, almost to himself, Lord help this valley. The valley will be fine, Clara said, already moving toward the door, already feeling the old hunger rise in her chest like heat off a stoked fire. It's the men in it who ought to worry. She walked out into the bright, brutal Wyoming morning, past the barn toward the shed, where her father's kind of magic was waiting to be woken up after years of silence. And behind her, through the kitchen window, Caleb Hargrove watched his mail-order bride walk toward that forge, like a woman walking toward the only altar she'd ever truly wanted to kneel at, and felt something in his chest crack open that he did not yet have words for, and would not for a good while longer be brave enough to name. The forge did not light easy the first night. Clara worked until her hands blistered fresh over old scars, coaxing the ancient bellows back to life with scraps of leather cut from a worn-out saddle Caleb hadn't the heart to throw away. By the third night, the chimney drew clean, and flame licked up gold and hungry inside the stone hearth her father-in-law had built with his own 2 hands 30 years before she'd ever been born. You're gonna burn the whole place down, Caleb said, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her work the bellows like she'd been born to it, which in a manner of speaking she had. I know fire, Mr. Hargrove. Fire doesn't scare me. Didn't say it scared you. Said you were going to burn the place down. Then stand closer to the door, Clara said without looking up, and be ready to run. He didn't move from the doorway. He stayed the better part of an hour saying nothing, watching her heat a strip of scrap iron until it glowed the color of a harvest sunset, watching her lay it against the anvil and strike it true once, twice a third time, each blow ringing clean through the summer night like a bell calling something back from the dead. That's my daddy's rhythm, Caleb said quietly when she paused to wipe sweat from her brow. Same beat. Same pause between strikes. How'd you... Good ironwork has a rhythm to it, whoever's swinging the hammer, Mr. Hargrove. Steel doesn't care whose hands shape it. It only cares that the hands know what they're doing. He didn't answer that. But he didn't leave either. Not for a long while. And when he finally did walk back toward the house, Clara caught him glancing back over his shoulder twice, not with worry this time. With something that looked in the firelight almost like pride he didn't yet have permission to feel. The wagon wheel was the first real test. It belonged to Otis Grady, a widower who farmed 40 acres 2 miles north and had been making do with a cartwheel cracked clean through the iron rim for the better part of a month, patched with wire that groaned every time the wheel turned. He came by at dusk, hat in hand, asking Caleb if he might borrow a spare wheel or point him toward someone in town who could fix the one he had on account of harvest coming, and no way to haul his corn to the mill with a wheel fixing to snap in two. Caleb hesitated. Clara watched that hesitation from the kitchen window, watched him glance back toward the house toward her like a man standing at a fork in the road with a storm coming from both directions. "Bring it round back," Caleb said finally. "I got someone who might take a look." Otis Grady's eyebrows went up considerable when the someone turned out to be a woman in a leather apron with soot on her cheek and a hammer already in her hand. "Now hold on," he started. "Caleb, I don't mean no disrespect, but you want the wheel fixed, or you want to stand there jawing about who's holding the hammer?" Clara didn't look up from the forge, where she'd already begun heating the metal she'd need to weld the crack shut. "Because I've got fire going either way, and iron doesn't wait politely while men decide if they trust a woman's hands." Otis looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the ground jaw working and said nothing. "She's my wife," he said finally. Like that settled something. "And she's the best set of hands with iron this valley's gonna see. You want that wheel fixed proper, or you want to keep patching it with wire till it snaps under a full load of corn and breaks your neck in the ditch? Your choice, Otis." The old farmer chewed on that a long moment, working his jaw, the way men do when pride and practicality are wrestling behind their teeth. Then he set the wheel down against the shed wall. "Fix it," he said. "But I ain't saying nothing to nobody about who done it." "Wasn't asking you to," Clara said, and got to work. She had the crack welded and the rim trued within the hour, working with a speed and precision that made Otis Grady go quiet in a way that had nothing to do with disapproval anymore. When she handed the wheel back cooled and solid, he turned it over in his hands like he was checking for a trick. "Well, I'll be." He looked up at her. Something shifted in his weathered face. "That's better work than Whitcomb does in town, and he charges triple what I got in my pocket." "Then I'd say you got a bargain, Mr. Grady." "Ma'am." He tipped his hat slow and deliberate, the gesture of a man revising an opinion in real time. "I reckon I owe you my thanks, and my discretion, both." He left with the wheel and a sack of turnips he insisted on leaving as payment, since he had no coin to spare, and Clara stood in the doorway of the forge, watching him go, feeling something warm settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire still glowing behind her. "You did good," Caleb said low once Otis was well down the road. "I know," Clara said, and this time she let herself smile at him. Not the sharp, guarded smile she'd been rationing out since the wedding, but something looser, something real. "You could try telling me that, like you mean it though, instead of like it surprises you." "It does surprise me." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she was starting to recognize as the closest thing he had to nervousness. "Ain't never seen nothing like that. Not from a woman. Not from most men, if I'm honest. Get used to it," Clara said. "Because Otis Grady isn't going to keep quiet for long. Discretion has a short shelf life in a town this size." She was right, though it took 9 days instead of 1. Word moved through Cedar Hollow the way fire moves through dry grass. Slow at first, a smolder, nobody notices, and then all at once faster than anybody can outrun. It started with Otis Grady's cousin, who farmed the next section over, and noticed the wheel looked suspiciously better than it had any right to. It moved to the mill where Otis's corn got hauled without incident for the first time in a month. It reached the general store where the mill owner mentioned offhand that Grady's wheel looked like it had been reforged rather than patched. And from the general store, propelled by the particular velocity of small-town gossip, it reached Ruth Calloway inside of an afternoon. "I heard," Ruth said to her husband loud enough to carry through the open window of their house and clean across the street, "that Caleb Hargrove's mail-order wife has been playing blacksmith out at that old shed of his. Can you imagine? A grown woman playing at a man's trade, and Caleb letting her do it plain as day." The story grew teeth as it traveled. By the time it reached the church social 3 days later, Clara wasn't just fixing wheels in secret. She was, according to the most colorful version, wearing trousers, cursing like a mule skinner, and had allegedly threatened to horsewhip anyone who questioned her. None of it was true. All of it stuck. Caleb came home from town that evening with a face like a thundercloud, boots hitting the porch steps harder than necessary. "They're talking," he said, before Clara had even set down her mending. "Whole town's talking. Ruth Calloway's telling anybody who'll stand still long enough that I've lost control of my own house." "Have you?" Clara asked, and did not look up from her sewing. "That ain't the point." "It's precisely the point, Mr. Hargrove." She set the needle down, now met his eyes square. "You told me to keep it quiet a while longer, and I did. Every soul who's come to that forge, I asked them to hold their tongue, and most did for a time. But you cannot fix a wheel that saves a man's harvest and expect the whole valley to forget it happened just because it's inconvenient for your pride." "It ain't about pride." "Isn't it?" He didn't answer right away, and in the silence, Clara watched something war behind his eyes, the same battle she'd glimpsed the first night at the forge. The same fork in the road. "I got contracts coming due," he said, finally quieter now. "Cattle drive in 6 weeks, and I'm selling to Thaddeus Kane, same as every rancher in this valley, on account of he's the only buyer with the capital to move a herd this size to the railhead. Man like that hears his suppliers can't keep their own households in order. He starts wondering what else might be out of order. Starts wondering if maybe he ought to look elsewhere for his cattle. Or worse, starts wondering if maybe there's an opportunity in a rancher who's looking shaky. And you think fixing a wagon wheel makes you look shaky? I think a woman working iron in a man's forge is the kind of thing men like Kane remember. And men like Kane don't forget things that make other men look weak. Not when there's an angle in it for him." Clara studied her husband for a long moment. Really studied him. The tightness around his eyes, the way his hands had curled into loose fists at his sides without him seeming to notice. "Tell me about this Thaddeus Kane," she said. "Tapui." Thaddeus Kane owned more of Cedar Hollow than any single deed could account for. He held the note on half the ranches in the valley, controlled the only cattle contract worth signing, and had a smile, Caleb said, like a man who'd learned charm, the way other men learned trades, as a tool, sharpened for use, never mistaken for kindness. "He's not from around here originally," Caleb said low over a supper neither of them had much appetite for. "Came out from back east maybe 8 years back, bought up the old Ferris spread when Ferris couldn't make his note, and he's been buying ever since. Land water rights cattle contracts. Man's got his hand in near everything that moves money through this valley. And you owe him. Everybody in this valley owes him one way or another." Caleb's jaw worked. "My daddy borrowed against the north pasture the year of the bad winter before he passed. I've been paying that note down slow, selling cattle through Kane's contract, same as everybody, on account of he's the only game in town for moving a herd east. Man sets his own prices, and there ain't nobody to compete with him. So you take what he offers, or you don't sell at all." "That sounds less like business," Clara said carefully, "and more like a noose that hasn't finished tightening yet." Caleb didn't argue the point. That more than anything he might have said told her how close to the truth she'd landed. "I ain't saying Kane's gonna ruin us over a wagon wheel," he said. "I'm saying a man like that collects reasons to squeeze harder, same way another man collects debts. And I don't aim to hand him one, not when the herd sale's the difference between keeping this ranch and losing it, same as my daddy near lost it." Clara sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way she'd turn a piece of iron before deciding how to shape it. "Then we'll be careful," she said finally. "Not silent, careful. There's a difference, Mr. Hargrove, and I intend for you to learn it." The difference, as it turned out, arrived on their doorstep 4 mornings later in the shape of a young woman named Sarah Pruitt, 16 years old, breathless from running the better part of 2 miles, her mother's sewing scissors clutched in one fist and terror plain across her face. "Please," she gasped, before Clara had even gotten the door fully open. "Please, ma'am, I heard everyone says you can fix things. Iron things, and my mama's plow blade broke clean through this morning, and Papa's laid up with his back, and we got no way to finish planting before the rain comes, and the Hendersons are already saying they'll buy our section if we can't make the season. Breathe, Clara said, taking the girl by the shoulders, steadying her. Start from the beginning. Slowly. The story came out in pieces, but the shape of it was plain enough. The Pruitt family barely holding on to 40 acres of leased land. One bad season away from losing everything to a buyer who was. Sarah said, with a child's plain honesty already circling like a vulture that smelled weakness. The plow blade, their only plow blade, no money for a replacement, had snapped that morning against a buried rock, and without it, there was no finishing the planting, and without the planting, there was no harvest, and without the harvest, there was no keeping the land. Bring it, Clara said. Now, before your father gets any ideas about trying to plow with a broken blade and putting his back out worse. Sarah Pruitt's face crumpled with relief, so raw it made Clara's throat tighten. You'll really fix it? I'll fix it, Clara said. Go. Run home and bring me that blade, and I'll have it ready before your mother's finished worrying a hole through her apron. The girl ran. Clara turned to find Caleb standing in the doorway behind her, having heard the whole exchange, his expression unreadable. That's the Pruitt girl, he said. Family's barely hanging on as it is. Land's leased from Kane, matter of fact, same as half the small farms out this way. He's been buying up leases quiet-like past couple years. Man loses his lease, loses everything. Then I suppose it's fortunate, Clara said, already moving toward the forge, already feeling the old fire rising in her chest, that his lease isn't going to be lost over a broken plow blade. Not while I've got a working forge and 2 capable hands. Clara! Caleb caught her arm, gentle but firm, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of green hidden in the gray of his eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him from a morning already spent in the sun. If word gets to Kane that you're fixin' tools for families leasin' his land, savin' harvests, he's half hopin' will fail, so he can foreclose and take the land back cheap. That ain't just gossip no more. That's you standin' directly in the man's way. That's a different kind of danger. Clara looked up at him. Are you telling me not to help her? The silence stretched long enough that a hawk cried somewhere overhead, circling. No, Caleb said, finally low and rough. I'm telling you, I'm scared of what happens if you do, which ain't the same thing as telling you not to. Good, Clara said, and pulled her arm free gentle. Because I wasn't going to listen either way. She fixed the Pruitt plow blade in under an hour, working with a fury and precision that left Sarah Pruitt staring at her like she'd witnessed something close to a miracle. When the girl tried to press a few precious coins into her hand, Clara closed the girl's fingers back around the money and shook her head. Keep it. Buy your mother something pretty when the harvest comes in good. That'll be payment enough. Sarah Pruitt left in tears. Good tears. The kind that come from a weightlifting rather than settling, and Clara stood in the doorway of the forge, watching her run home with the mended blade held against her chest like something precious, and felt, for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, entirely and completely herself. That feeling lasted exactly 2 days. The knock came on a Thursday evening, sharp and confident, the knock of a man unaccustomed to waiting for doors to open. Caleb answered it, and Clara, elbow-deep in bread dough at the kitchen table, heard the voice before she saw the face, and something in her stomach went cold and still. Evenin' Hargrove. Hope I ain't catchin' you at a poor time. Mr. Kane. Caleb's voice had gone flat, careful, the voice of a man walking across thin ice and trying not to let the cracking show. Wasn't expectin' you out this way. Wasn't plannin' to be out this way, if I'm honest. But a man hears interestin' things, and interestin' things have a way of pullin' a fella off his usual road. A pause, and Clara could feel the weight of an unseen gaze moving past Caleb into the house toward her. Evenin', ma'am. You'd be the new Mrs. Hargrove, I take it. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into view, meeting the man square. Thaddeus Kane was not what she'd braced herself for. No horns, no obvious villainy, just a well-dressed man of perhaps 50 silver at the temples, a smile that sat on his face like a coat he'd learned to wear so well it looked natural. His eyes, though. His eyes did not smile at all. "Mr. Kane," she said. "I've heard your name mentioned once or twice. I imagine you have. Man in my position, folks tend to mention my name a fair amount." He stepped inside without quite being invited, hat in hand, eyes moving over the room with the particular thoroughness of a man taking inventory. "I'll get straight to it since I know you folks got supper waitin'. Word's travelin' round this valley, and word travels fast in a place this small. You understand that Mrs. Hargrove here has been doin' ironwork, fixin' wheels, plow blades and the like. That true?" The silence stretched. Caleb's jaw tightened. "It's true," Clara said before Caleb could decide how to answer for her. "I was raised in a blacksmith shop, Mr. Kane. I know my way around iron better than most men in this valley, and I've been putting that knowledge to use where it's needed." Something flickered behind Kane's eyes, not quite surprise, more like the particular interest of a man discovering an unexpected variable in a calculation he'd thought settled. "Well?" He turned the words over slow, like he was tasting them. "Ain't that something? A lady blacksmith right here in Cedar Hollow. Don't hardly know what to make of that." "You don't have to make anything of it," Caleb said, stepping forward, putting himself half a step in front of Clara, without seeming to think about it. "It's a family matter, Kane. Don't concern the herd contract none. Everything concerns the herd contract Hargrove when I'm the one holding the note on your north pasture." Kane's voice stayed pleasant, even warm, which somehow made the words land harder than a shout would have. "See, here's my trouble. I got a business built on trust. Ranchers sell me their herds, I move 'em east, everybody makes their money, and sleeps easy. That trust depends on folks believin' the men I do business with are, how should I put this, stable, reliable, men whose households run in good order. My household runs fine," Caleb said low. "I'm sure it does from where you're standin'." Kane's gaze slid back to Clara, unhurried assessing. "But you understand my position, surely. A rancher whose wife is out doin' men's work, stirrin' up talk all through the valley, some folks might start wonderin' what else might be a little unconventional about that household. And when a man's got a herd contract worth thousands of dollars restin' on other men's confidence in him, ma'am, unconventional ain't exactly a comfortable word to have floatin' around." Clara felt the old anger rising, banked and dangerous, but she kept her voice level, cool as quenched steel. "Are you threatening my husband's contract, Mr. Kane, because I mended a wagon wheel? Threatenin'?" Kane's smile widened, and there was something genuinely, chillingly amused in it now. "Ma'am, I never threaten. I simply observe. And I observe that a valley full of folks talking about the Hargrove household tends to make other folks, buyers, lenders, men, whose opinions carry weight, start asking questions I'd rather not have to answer on your behalf." "Then let them ask," Clara said. "I've never once been ashamed of my hands, Mr. Kane, and I don't intend to start now on account of gossip. You seem awfully invested in stirring yourself." The room went very quiet. Caleb's hand found the small of her back. Not quite a warning, more like a man bracing against something he could feel coming. Kane looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted the pleasant mask, sliding just slightly to reveal something colder underneath. "You've got spirit, Mrs. Hargrove. I'll give you that." He settled his hat back on his head, unhurried, a man in no rush because he already believed he held every card worth holding. "I do hope for your husband's sake that spirit don't cost him more than he can afford to pay. Herd contracts due for renewal come the autumn drive. I'd hate for anything unconventional to complicate the terms." He tipped his hat mockingly courteous. "Evenin', folks. Do enjoy your supper." He left as unhurried as he'd arrived, and neither Clara nor Caleb moved until the sound of his horse had faded entirely down the road. "That," Caleb said finally, voice tight as wire, "is exactly what I was afraid of." They argued that night, the first real argument of their short, strange marriage, conducted in low, furious tones, so as not to carry beyond the walls. "He's testing you," Clara said. "Men like that don't make threats outright. They plant doubt and wait to see if it grows roots. If you pull that forge door shut tomorrow, out of fear, you've handed him exactly the leverage he came looking for. And if I don't, and he decides to make good on something worse than doubt?" Caleb paced the length of the kitchen boots hard against the floorboards. You don't know that man, Clara. I've watched him squeeze 3 ranchers off their land in the years since he came out here. Always legal, always polite, always with some contract clause. Nobody read close enough till it was too late. He don't need to threaten outright. He just needs an excuse, and he'll manufacture the rest. So, your solution is to make me small, Clara said, quiet and sharp. To hide what I am, because a man with a silver tongue and a ledger book might disapprove. My solution, Caleb said, stopping, turning to face her full on, is to keep this ranch, the only thing my daddy left me besides debt, out of that man's hands. That's my solution, Clara. I ain't asking you to be small. I'm asking you to understand what's at stake if Kane decides we're a problem worth solving. Clara looked at him a long moment, and some of the fight went out of her, not surrender, but a kind of weary understanding. I do understand, she said finally. I understand better than you know, Mr. Hargrove, what it costs a family to lose everything to men who hold the paper. I watched it happen to my own father. I watched a bank take a forge he'd built with 40 years of his own sweat, because some clerk decided the numbers on a page mattered more than the work of a man's hands. Her voice cracked just slightly, and she hated it, and let it happen anyway. So don't lecture me about what's at stake. I know precisely what is at stake. I simply refuse to believe the answer is to disappear. Caleb's face changed, then the anger draining out of it replaced by something raw, something that looked almost like grief. I ain't asking you to disappear, he said, quiet now. I'm asking you to let me figure a way to protect both things I care about. The ranch and you. He said the last word like it surprised him to be saying it, like he hadn't quite meant to admit that he'd started caring about something he'd only ordered from a catalog 3 weeks before. Clara's breath caught. Both things, she repeated softly. Both things, Caleb said, and didn't look away. They found a fragile peace after that. Not a solution, not yet, but an understanding. Clara would keep working, but quieter, more careful, choosing which request to answer and which to gently turn aside, weighing each family's need against the risk of drawing Kane's eye further. Caleb, for his part, stopped arguing every time a neighbor showed up at the forge door, and started in small ways she noticed and treasured, defending her when talk turned ugly in town. It was Ruth Calloway who tested that peace, first cornering Caleb outside the general store, not 4 days after Kane's visit. I heard Thaddeus Kane paid you a call, Ruth said, not bothering to hide her satisfaction. Heard he wasn't too pleased about your wife's little hobby. Can't say I blame him. A blacksmith wife. Whatever will folks think? Folks'll think whatever they please, Ruth, same as they always do, Caleb said, tight-jawed. Don't much concern me what you make of it. It ought to concern you. Ruth pressed, lowering her voice to something almost gentle, almost kind, which made it worse. I'm only saying this out of care, Caleb Hargrove. You're a good man, and you deserve a wife who tends your house, 'stead of playing at a trade that ain't hers to claim. Kane's got influence over half this valley. You cross him over pride, you could lose everything your daddy built. My wife, Caleb said, each word deliberate, has saved 3 families' harvests this month with hands most men in this valley couldn't match with a full day's work. If that's shame, Ruth, then I reckon I'll wear it proud. He walked away before she could answer, and word of that exchange reached Clara before supper, carried by a farmhand who'd overheard and couldn't resist repeating it, and something in Clara's chest loosened for the first time in days. Bed. The peace lasted 11 days. It broke on a Tuesday morning when Elias Whitcomb, the town's official blacksmith, a heavy-set man with a florid face and a business that had been steadily losing custom to whispers of better, cheaper work, happening somewhere out past the Hargrove spread, marched into the general store loud enough for half the street to hear. I know where my custom's been walking off to, he announced to anyone within earshot. Hargrove's got himself a woman doing smith work out at his place undercutting honest tradesmen, and I aim to see something done about it. Ain't right. Ain't legal neither, far as I know. Woman working a trade guild's got no business claiming. There ain't no trade guild in Cedar Hollow, Elias, someone pointed out. There ought to be, Whitcomb snapped. And there ought to be rules about who's allowed to swing a hammer for coin in this town. I got a family to feed, same as anybody, and I ain't about to sit quiet while some fancy Eastern woman steals bread from my children's mouths. It should have stayed a blacksmith's grievance, small and containable. But Elias Whitcomb was not a subtle man, and by that evening half of Cedar Hollow had heard some version of the complaint, and the version that reached Thaddeus Kane's ears delivered. Clara would later learn by Ruth Calloway herself, eager to be useful to a man of Kane's standing, was considerably sharper than the truth. Kane arrived at the Hargrove Ranch the following afternoon, and this time he did not bother with pleasantries. "Seems your wife stirred up more trouble than a broke wagon wheel ought to account for," he said, not bothering to dismount. "Whitcomb's threatening to take his complaint to the territorial circuit judge when he comes through next month, claims your wife's operating an unlicensed trade, undermining an established business. Might not amount to much legally. Might amount to a great deal of embarrassment publicly, at exactly the time I'm deciding whether to renew your herd contract for another season."
That's
Whitcomb's grudge, not mine, Caleb said. "And it's got nothing to do with the cattle. Everything's got something to do with everything Hargrove, when reputation's the currency a man trades in." Kane's gaze slid unhurried toward the shed, toward the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney where Clara was at that moment working iron for a family 2 sections over. "I'll be frank with you, since frankness seems to be the fashion in your household these days. I've been considering expanding my interests in this valley, buying up a few more leases, a few more notes, consolidating things a bit. Makes for smoother business, fewer variables to manage. Your North Pasture note happens to be one of the notes I'd be interested in acquiring outright should the opportunity present itself. A man in financial difficulty facing public embarrassment and a threatened contract might find that opportunity considerably more attractive than he would otherwise." The words landed like a blow. Clara, who had come to the shed door at the sound of hooves and was standing close enough now to hear every word, felt her stomach drop clean through the floor. "You're saying you want my land," Caleb said, voice gone very quiet, very dangerous. "I'm saying I want smooth business, Hargrove. What that looks like is entirely up to you." Kane finally turned his horse unhurried as always. "You've got till the circuit judge comes through. I'd think hard on how you want this valley to see you when he does a rancher in good standing, or a man who couldn't keep his own house and his own wife in order." His eyes flicked once more toward Clara, cold and assessing. "Good day, Mrs. Hargrove. Do give some thought to what your hobbies costin' your husband."
Ronnie.
He rode off, and this time neither of them spoke for a long, long while. "He wants the land," Clara said finally into the silence. "This was never about propriety, Caleb. This is about him wanting your North Pasture and using me as the crack to pry it open." "I know it." Caleb's voice was rough raw. "I've been paying that note down slow as I can manage, but if he calls it early, or if Whitcomb's complaint gives him legal cover to squeeze the terms—" He broke off, dragged both hands down his face. "I could lose this ranch, Clara. Same as my daddy near lost it. Same as the Pruitts. Same as half this valley's already losing it piece by piece to a man who never once has to swing a hammer or plow a field himself." Clara stood very still, feeling the weight of it settle over her. The truth she'd suspected since Sarah Pruitt had come running with her mother's broken plow blade now confirmed in Kane's own mouth. This was not one greedy man circling one struggling ranch. This was a pattern, a system. Land and leases and notes quietly consolidated family by family, while Cedar Hollow told itself stories about scandalous wives and unlicensed trades to keep from looking too closely at the man actually stealing their futures out from under them. "Then we don't give him the crack," she said low and fierce. "We don't shrink. We don't hide. We give this valley something to see that isn't scandal, Caleb. We give them proof." "Proof of what? That good work speaks louder than gossip," Clara said, and felt something hardening inside her chest, something taking the shape of a plan, the way hot iron takes the shape of a mold. "Elias Whitcomb wants to accuse me before the circuit judge of undermining honest trade. Let him, let every family whose harvest I've saved, stand up and say different. Let Cain see exactly how much this valley depends on the work he's trying to shame out of existence. Caleb looked at her, something fierce and frightened and hopeful, all warring across his face at once. That's a hell of a risk, Clara. So is doing nothing, she said. So is watching you lose everything your father built because we were too afraid to let the truth stand in daylight. He was quiet a long moment, the wind picking up around them, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain. All right, he said finally, and reached for her hand, the first time he'd done so since the wedding, without ceremony or courtesy prompting. It just the simple human need to hold on to something steady in a storm that was only beginning to gather. All right, Clara, we don't hide. Behind them, unnoticed in the gathering dusk, a rider sat watching from the ridge above the ranch. Not Cain himself, but one of his men sent to watch and report, and what he carried back to town that night would set in motion something neither Clara nor Caleb yet had any way of seeing coming. The rider Cain had sent to watch the ranch reported back before sunrise, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, Thaddeus Cain already knew more about the Hargrove household's plans than Caleb had told a single soul in town. That knowledge became a weapon within the week. Elias Whitcomb filed his formal complaint on a Monday, standing before the town notary with a piece of paper he could barely read, himself dictated to him, though nobody in Cedar Hollow would learn this for some time yet, by a lawyer on Thaddeus Cain's payroll. The complaint accused Clara Hargrove of practicing an unlicensed trade of undermining established commerce, and in language that made Clara's hands curl into fists when she finally heard it read aloud, of endangering the moral order of the community. Moral order, Clara repeated, standing in the doorway of the general store where the notice had been posted for all to read. As though iron has a conscience, and mine has offended it. It ain't about the iron, said Hannah Voss, the storekeeper's wife, who'd slipped Clara the news before the whole town descended on the posting. It's about making you small enough that nobody minds when Cain finishes what he's startin'. Whitcomb's just the knife. Somebody else is doing the cuttin'. Clara said nothing to that because there was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like fear, and she had promised herself, standing in that forged doorway with her father's hammer in her hand, that she would not let this valley see her afraid. But that night, alone with Caleb over a supper, neither of them touched, the fear came out anyway. Circuit judge arrives in 19 days, Caleb said, staring at his plate like it might offer answers. Whitcomb's complaint gets heard first thing, and Cain'll be sitting right there in that courtroom making sure everybody remembers exactly whose favor to curry. Then we have 19 days to make sure the whole valley remembers something else. Clara reached across the table, covered his hand with hers, a gesture that had become in these last weeks less deliberate and more instinctive, the way a person reaches for warmth without thinking. Every family I've helped, every tool I've mended. 19 days is enough time to remind Cedar Hollow what it actually needs, Caleb, if we're brave enough to let them see it plain. And if it ain't enough, Clara didn't have an answer for that. Neither of them did. The first crack in their plan came from a direction Clara hadn't braced for. Garrett Cain. No relation to Thaddeus, despite the shared name. A coincidence the boy had spent his whole young life having to explain, was 15 years old. Gangly, quiet, the son of the town's ailing doctor, and he had been coming to the forge in secret for the better part of 2 weeks, ostensibly to fetch tools for his father's medical instruments, but staying longer, each visit watching Clara work, with an attention that went well past curiosity. You want to learn? Clara said finally on the 9th visit, not looking up from the horseshoe she was shaping. Just say so, boy. I don't bite. The boy went red to his ears. My pa says smith work ain't for a doctor's son. Says I ought to be studying his trade, not this. Your pa's trade and my trade aren't so different as you'd think. Clara set down her hammer, wiped her hands, studied him properly for the first time. Both of us take something broken and make it whole again. Difference is, I use fire and he uses medicine. Same instinct underneath. You really think that? I really do. She held out the tongs. Go on then. If you're going to hover in my doorway wasting daylight, you might as well make yourself useful. It was a small thing teaching a doctor's son to hold tongs steady over a flame. It should have stayed small. But word of it reached Whitcomb inside of 3 days, twisted into something uglier by the time it traveled. Not a woman teaching a curious boy a skill, but a woman corrupting the town doctor's son, pulling him from a respectable path toward some scandalous, unnatural trade. Dr. Kane. The boy's father, a thin, exhausted man who spent more hours tending the valley's sick than he spent sleeping, arrived at the ranch in a fury Clara hadn't expected from a man she'd only ever seen gentle. "My son is not your apprentice," he said, standing rigid in the yard, refusing Caleb's offer of a seat, refusing everything except the argument he'd clearly rehearsed the whole ride out. "I've spent 15 years grooming that boy toward medicine, toward something that'll lift him past this valley, and you've got him swinging a hammer like some blacksmith's helper. I won't have it, Mrs. Hargrove. I won't have my son's future traded for your hobby." "Dr. Kane." Clara kept her voice level, though something in her chest ached at the accusation. "Your son came to me. I never once sought him out. And I'd remind you that a boy who spends his afternoons learning patience, precision, and the discipline of working with his hands isn't wasting his future. He's building the kind of character that'll serve him well no matter which trade he chooses." "That's not your decision to make." "No," Clara agreed. "It's his, and yours. But it was never mine to take from him, and I'll not apologize for a boy's curiosity, Doctor. If you want him to stop coming, tell him so yourself. I won't turn him away, but I won't chase him either." The doctor left unsatisfied, and that night Garrett Kane did not come to the forge, and Clara felt the absence like a small, unexpected grief. One more thread of the valley's trust, fraying under pressure, that had nothing to do with the quality of her work, and everything to do with the fear Kane and Whitcomb had spent weeks cultivating. The second crack came 4 days later, and this one drew blood. It was late afternoon when Caleb rode in from the north pasture at a gallop that told Clara something was badly wrong before he'd even reined in. "Fence line's cut," he said, swinging down before his horse had fully stopped. "Whole north section. Somebody took wire cutters to near a quarter-mile of fence sometime last night, and I got cattle scattered halfway to the Pruitt place by the time I found the gap." "Kane," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "Can't prove it. Won't ever prove it. Man's too careful to leave his own hand on something like this. But I know it in my gut, Clara. Fence didn't cut itself, and it sure didn't happen the same week Whitcomb's complaint goes before the judge by pure coincidence." They spent the next 2 days rounding scattered cattle, Clara working alongside him, despite his protests, riding fence line in the brutal summer heat, her hands blistering anew against reins instead of hammer. And by the time the herd was gathered and the fence mended with iron stays, Clara forged herself stronger than what had been there before both of them were hollowed out with exhaustion and something harder to name. "He's tightening the noose," Clara said that night, too tired for anything but plain speech. The complaint, the doctor, now the fence. He's testing every weak point, seeing which one breaks first. "And when the judge hears Whitcomb's complaint," Caleb said grimly, "he'll have a fresh story to tell too. Rancher can't even keep his fence line secure, household in disarray, every little thing adding up to a picture he once painted." Clara sat with that a long moment, the fire in the hearth burning low, and felt something shift inside her. Not fear anymore exactly, but a colder, harder resolve. "Then we stop playing defense," she said. "We've spent 3 weeks reacting to whatever Kane throws at us. It's time we made him react to something instead." "What do you have in mind?" "The circuit judge isn't the only person whose opinion matters in this valley," Clara said slowly, the plan taking shape even as she spoke it aloud. "Every family I've helped has a voice. Every farmer whose harvest I saved. Every widow whose gate hinge I mended for nothing but gratitude. They've all got a story to tell if someone asks them to tell it. We stop hiding the work, Caleb. We stop asking people to keep quiet. We let the whole valley see plain as day exactly what Kane's trying to bury."
Shamikite.
They began the following morning, and it was Caleb, surprisingly, who took the lead, riding from farm to farm, not to ask for silence anymore, but to ask for testimony for neighbors willing to stand up when the circuit judge arrived and say plainly what Clara's hands had done for them. Some refused, too frightened of Cain's reach to risk his displeasure. But more agreed than either of them had dared hope, Otis Grady first, and Loudest still furious on Clara's behalf for the insult of Whitcomb's complaint. The Pruitt family, whose harvest now stood tall and gold in fields that would have gone fallow without a mended plow blade. A dozen others' families whose broken tools and scattered fortunes Clara had quietly set right over the preceding weeks. "You've built something out here," Caleb said one evening, watching Clara bank the forge fire for the night, soot-streaked and weary, but lit from within with something that hadn't been there the day she stepped off that stagecoach. "Something this valley didn't know it was missing till you showed up and started fixing it." "I didn't build it alone," Clara said. "You let the door stay open, Caleb. That first night when you could have boarded that forge shut and told me to sit pretty in the parlor, you didn't. Don't forget that counts for something." He was quiet a moment, watching her in the dying firelight. "There's things I'm starting to feel, Clara, that I didn't order from any catalog. Didn't ask for. Didn't know how to want till you were standing in my kitchen telling Ruth Calloway off at our own wedding." Clara's breath caught. The forge ticked and settled around them, the only sound in the gathering dark. "Caleb, I ain't asking you to say anything back," he said quickly, almost embarrassed by his own honesty. "Just figured you ought to know. Whatever happens with Cain, whatever the judge decides, I ain't sorry I married you. Not for 1 hour of it, even the hard ones." She crossed the small distance between them before she'd fully decided to, and pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her hand, fast, unguarded, honest in a way his words so rarely managed to be. "Neither am I," she said softly. "Not for 1 hour." He kissed her. Then not the dry, dutiful peck he'd given her at the altar, but something real. Something that tasted of wood smoke and worry, and the particular relief of two people finally admitting what had been growing between them in the spaces of shared work and shared danger. It didn't last long. The world outside the forge was still burning with threat, and both of them knew it. But for one suspended moment, none of that mattered. Then a horse's hooves sounded on the road fast and urgent, and the moment shattered. It was Sarah Pruitt, again breathless this time, not with fear for her own family, but with news that turned Clara's blood to ice. "They arrested him," she gasped, half falling off her borrowed horse. "Mr. Grady Otis, the sheriff, came and arrested him not an hour past, saying he stole cattle off the Cain spread, saying there's witnesses and everything. And Mrs. Grady's beside herself, and everybody in town saying it proves what Whitcomb's been saying all along, that things have gone wild and lawless out this way since—" She stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air regardless. "Since Clara came." "That's a lie," Caleb said flatly. "Otis Grady ain't stole a single head of cattle in his whole life. Man's honest to a fault." "Don't matter if it's a lie," Sarah said, tears streaking through the dust on her face. "Sheriff's got a witness swearing he saw Otis driving Cain cattle off in the night, and the judge arrives in 8 days, and now there's talk of a trial happening, same time as Whitcomb's complaint, and everybody's saying the whole valley's gone crooked since the blacksmith's daughter came to town." Clara felt the ground shift beneath her, the careful plan they'd spent a week building, suddenly buried under an avalanche neither of them had seen coming. "This is Cain," she said, low and furious. "This is exactly what we feared. He's not testing weak points anymore, Caleb. He's manufacturing them. I know it." Caleb's hands had curled into fists. "But knowing it and proving it are two different animals, and Otis is sitting in a jail cell right now while Cain's witness tells his story to anybody who'll listen." "Then we find out who this witness is," Clara said, "and we find out exactly what Cain promised him to lie." The witness turned out to be a drifter named Cyrus Dell, a man with no ties to the valley, no reputation to protect. And Clara suspected the moment she laid eyes on him, lounging outside the jailhouse with new boots and a new hat that didn't match the rest of his threadbare clothes, no shortage of freshly acquired money. "Somebody paid for those boots," Clara murmured to Caleb, watching from across the street. "A drifter doesn't come into new boots by accident, not in a town where half the honest families can barely afford flour." "Can't prove that neither," Caleb said grimly. "No, but I know someone who might be able to loosen his tongue where a sheriff's questions couldn't." That someone was Hannah Voss, the storekeeper's wife, whose gossip network ran deeper and wider than Ruth Calloway's ever had, precisely because Hannah traded in kindness rather than cruelty, and people trusted her with things they'd never trust, to a woman who wielded rumor like a blade. It took 2 days of careful, patient inquiry. Hannah chatting up the drifter over free meals at the store, plying him with sympathy and whiskey money in equal measure, before the truth came loose. Cyrus Dell hadn't seen Otis Grady steal a single cow. He'd been paid $20 more money than he'd seen in a year of drifting to swear he had. Paid by who? Clara pressed when Hannah brought the news to the forge under cover of dusk. Won't say a name outright. Too scared. But he let slip. It was a man who works Kane's spread come to him private offering the money if he'd testify come the circuit judge's hearing. Hannah's face was grim. Won't sign nothing, won't say it to the sheriff. Too afraid of what happens if Kane finds out he talked. Then we need something more than a scared drifter's whisper, Caleb said. We need proof the sheriff can act on, or Otis sits in that cell till the judge arrives and decides his fate based on a paid lie. Clara thought hard, the gears of her mind turning the way they turned over a difficult piece of ironwork, looking for the weak point. The place where enough pressure applied correctly would make the whole structure give. The cattle, she said slowly. If Otis never stole them, then wherever Kane's missing cattle actually went, there'll be a trail. Brands don't lie even when men do. If we can find where those cattle really ended up. That's Kane's land, Caleb said. You're talking about searching a powerful man's property on nothing but a hunch. I'm talking about finding the truth, Clara said, before an innocent man loses his freedom to protect a guilty one's ambition. They didn't search Kane's land. That would have been reckless, illegal, exactly the kind of misstep Kane would exploit without mercy. Instead, they found something better. Garrett Kane, the doctor's son, still smarting from his father's forbidding him. The forge still watching from the edges of a town he'd never quite fit into, came to Caleb 3 nights later with information that changed everything. I ain't supposed to be here, the boy said, breathless, having slipped out past his sleeping father. But I heard something riding past the Kane spread 2 nights back fetching medicine for old Mrs. Ferris. Heard men talking near the North Corral. Talking about cattle they'd moved off the Grady section and folded into Kane's own herd brands, and all covering the tracks before anybody thought to look close. You're certain of what you heard? Clara pressed, heart pounding. Certain as I can be, ma'am. One of 'em laughed about it. Said Grady'd hang for a theft he never done, and Kane'd have his section for pennies on the dollar once the man's ruined and his widow's too scared to fight the note. The boy's voice shook. I didn't say nothing before 'cause I was scared, and 'cause my pa already thinks I spend too much time round trouble on account of comin' here. But Mr. Grady's sittin' in that jail for something he didn't do, and I couldn't live with myself keepin' quiet. Clara looked at this boy, 15 years old, defying his father's forbidding, risking Kane's wrath because a woman with a hammer had once told him that patience and precision built character no matter the trade, and felt something fierce and grateful rise in her chest. You did right, Garrett, she said. You did exactly right. What happens now? Now, Caleb said, already moving toward his horse. We take what you heard to the sheriff, and we pray to God he's honest enough to listen even with Kane's shadow hanging over this whole valley. The sheriff, to his credit, was more honest than Kane had likely accounted for a weathered man named Beauregard Hicks, who'd worn the badge long enough to have seen every flavor of small-town corruption and had grown over the years quietly allergic to being used as a tool for it. He listened to Garrett's account, listened to Hannah's careful retelling of the drifter's confession, and set his jaw in a way that suggested he'd already begun connecting threads he'd been too cautious or too pressured to pull before. I can't act on a boy's overheard talk alone, he said. Not against a man like Kane. I need something harder. Then question the drifter yourself, Clara said. Properly under oath with the threat of perjury hanging over him instead of just Hannah's kindness. A man who'll lie for $20 might find his tongue looser when the alternative is a cell of his own. Sheriff Hicks studied her a long moment. You're a determined woman, Mrs. Hargrove. I'll say that for you. I've been called worse this month, Sheriff. I'll take determined. He brought Cyrus Dell in for formal questioning that same evening, and whatever courage 20 stolen dollars had bought the drifter evaporated entirely under Sheriff Hicks's steady, patient pressure. By midnight, Dell had signed a confession paid to lie. Paid by a foreman on Kane's payroll. Cattle never stolen at all, simply moved and rebranded to manufacture a crime that had never actually occurred. Otis Grady walked out of that jail cell at dawn, hollow-eyed and shaking into his wife's arms, and word of his release and the truth behind it began moving through Cedar Hollow with the same wildfire speed that had once carried Whitcomb's accusations. But Thaddeus Kane was not a man who lost quietly, and by midday, Clara understood exactly how far he was willing to go to salvage what her hammer, her courage, and one brave boy's honesty had just cost him. He came to the ranch himself this time, no pretense of pleasantry left in his bearing at all. "You've made a grave mistake, Mrs. Hargrove," he said, dismounting without invitation, his charm entirely stripped away to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "I don't take kindly to being made a fool of in my own valley. You made yourself a fool, Mr. Kane, the moment you paid a drifter to lie about a good man's honesty," Clara said, standing her ground, though her heart hammered fierce against her ribs. "I only helped the truth find its way to daylight." The truth. Kane's laugh was ugly, humorless. "You think this valley runs on truth? It runs on debt and leverage, and men smart enough to hold both. You've cost me a hired hand who'll hang for his part in this before the season's out, and you've cost me the Grady section I'd already half purchased on paper. I do not forgive costs like that, Mrs. Hargrove, and I do not forget them." "Is that a threat?" Caleb stepped forward, voice low and dangerous in a way Clara hadn't heard from him before. "It's a promise," Kane said, swinging back onto his horse. "Your note comes due in full at season's end. Hargrove every dollar, no extensions, no grace. And should you find yourself unable to pay in full, well." His eyes slid to Clara, cold as the iron she worked. "I understand the bank's quite efficient at foreclosure when properly motivated. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. I promise you, it won't last long." He rode off, leaving behind a silence heavy with everything that had just been declared. Not gossip anymore, not innuendo. War plain and undisguised, and a debt that would within the season decide whether the Hargrove Ranch survived at all. Clara stood very still in the settling dust, her hand finding Caleb's, without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other, and understood with a clarity that felt almost like relief that whatever came next would not be settled by hiding, or by silence, or by anything less than everything they both had left to give. The number Kane's note demanded came to $1,100, due whole and entire by the last day of September, and Caleb Hargrove sat at his kitchen table for 3 nights, running with a ledger book open in front of him, doing arithmetic that never once came out in his favor. "Best I can manage from the herd sale is maybe 600, he said. The 4th night voice hollowed out from lack of sleep. "Even sellin' every head I got, even at fair market instead of Kane's contract rate, I'm still shy $500. I got no way of raisin' before season's end." "Then we don't sell through Kane's contract at all," Clara said. "You said yourself he's not the only buyer in the territory, only the closest and the easiest. If there's a rail agent at Laramie willing to deal direct, that's 140 miles of driving cattle through open country, Clara, with a crew I can't afford to hire, and a timeline that don't leave room for error. Man tried that alone, he's asking to lose half his herd to weather or wolves before he ever sees a rail car. Then you won't do it alone." Clara set her jaw. The same set to it he'd learned meant she'd already decided something, and was only informing him of the decision, rather than asking permission. "Every family I've helped this summer owes you something, whether they'll say it plain or not. Otis Grady's got sons old enough to ride drive. The Pruitts have hands they can spare, once their own harvest's in. We ask Caleb. We ask the whole valley to help drive that herd to Laramie, and we sell direct, and we cut Kane out of the profit he's been skimming off every rancher in this valley for years." Caleb stared at her like she'd suggested they fly to the railhead on angel wings. "You're talking about organizing half of Cedar Hollow into a cattle drive inside of 6 weeks. "I'm talking about survival," Clara said. which this valley seems remarkably practiced at Mr. Hargrove whenever it stops being too proud or too frightened to ask its neighbors for help. The asking took 4 days, and it was harder than either of them had anticipated because fear of Cain ran deeper in Cedar Hollow than Clara had fully understood, until she watched grown men who'd sworn testimony on Otis Grady's behalf, not 2 weeks prior, hesitate at the idea of open public defiance against the man who held half their notes. "I owe him money same as everybody." Ezra Voss. Hannah's husband admitted shamefaced when Caleb asked for help with the drive. "Can't rightly risk his displeasure, not with my own note comin' due come spring." "I'm sorry, Caleb, truly, but I got a family to think of." It was a refusal Clara heard in one form or another from nearly a dozen households. Sympathy freely given help withheld the particular cowardice of people who wanted to be brave but couldn't quite afford the price of it. She might have despaired if not for Otis Grady, who showed up at the ranch unannounced on the 5th morning with his 2 grown sons, 3 neighbors, and an expression that suggested he'd spent considerable energy convincing all of them to come. "Cain liked to hang me for a crime I never done," he said simply. "Man can threaten my note all he wants. Wasn't for your wife and that Cain boy's courage, I'd be swinging from a rope by now instead of standing in your yard. I don't forget debts like that, Hargrove, and neither do my boys." Others trickled in over the following days. Not the majority of the valley, but enough. Sarah Pruitt's father still weak in the back, but insistent on riding fence support if nothing more strenuous. 2 of Hannah Voss's cousins from the next valley over, unbeholden to Cain's notes, and therefore unafraid of his reach. A dozen hands in total, cobbled together from gratitude and stubbornness in roughly equal measure, enough to attempt a 140-mile drive that would have been reckless with fewer, and remain dangerous even so. "It ain't a full crew," Caleb said, studying the assembled group the morning they were set to depart. "But it's more than I had any right to expect 2 weeks back." "It's enough," Clara said, and prayed she was right. She was not supposed to ride the drive herself. That had been the plan, the sensible plan, the plan where Clara stayed behind to manage the ranch and the forge while Caleb led the herd east. The plan lasted exactly until the morning of departure, when Clara appeared at the corral in trousers, borrowed from one of Otis Grady's sons, her father's tools packed into saddlebags, and an expression that dared anyone present to argue with her. "Clara!" Caleb's voice carried a warning. "This ain't a place for—" "If you say a place for a lady, Mr. Hargrove, I will leave you to drive this herd entirely, without the benefit of someone who can reforge a broken axle or a bent horseshoe 100 miles from the nearest town." She swung up onto the horse she'd claimed with a competence that silenced whatever protest he'd been forming. A drive this size, this understaffed, cannot afford to leave a skilled hand behind simply because that hand belongs to a woman. You know this. Stop wasting daylight arguing with what you already know to be true. He looked at her a long moment, something helpless and admiring warring in his expression, and then he laughed, short, surprised entirely, genuine. "Lord help me," he said, echoing words he'd spoken weeks before, back when her ambitions had seemed merely local, merely a matter of one forge and one skeptical valley. "All right, Mrs. Hargrove, ride with us then. But you take orders same as anybody on this drive, and when I say something's dangerous, I need you to trust it's dangerous and not just me being over-careful." "Agreed," Clara said, "provided you extend me the same courtesy when I tell you an axle's about to fail before it actually does." "Fair enough," Caleb said, and this time the words came without hesitation, without the careful diplomacy of a man still measuring his wife against some old narrow idea of what a wife should be. Just simple agreement between equals, between partners. The drive itself tested every promise either of them had made. 3 days in a summer storm broke over the herd, with a violence that sent 200 head of cattle stampeding through open country in the dark, and Clara found herself riding flat out through driving rain and lightning, working alongside men twice her experience to turn the herd before it scattered beyond recovery. She lost her hat. She nearly lost her seat twice on ground gone slick and treacherous. By the time the herd finally settled exhausted and steaming in the post-storm chill, she was soaked through, shaking with cold, and spent adrenaline and prouder of herself than she'd ever been in her life. "You did good," Caleb said, finding her at the edge of camp wrapping a dry blanket around her shoulders with hands that lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Better than good. Half them men been riding cattle since they could walk, and you kept pace with every one of 'em." "I told you I could," Clara said, teeth chattering, too exhausted for false modesty. "You did tell me." He crouched in front of her, tucking the blanket closer, his gray eyes serious in the low light of the campfire. "I'm learnin' to listen better, Clara. Slower than I oughta, maybe, but I'm learnin'." She reached up, cold fingers finding his jaw, and kissed him, not with the desperate relief of their first real kiss back at the forge, but with something steadier now, something that had survived a stampede and a storm, and come out the other side, more certain of itself than before. "Keep learning," she murmured against his mouth. "I intend to keep surprising you for a good many years yet, Mr. Hargrove." The second crisis came not from weather, but from men, and it arrived on the 9th day of the drive, when 3 riders intercepted the herd at a river crossing and identified themselves with a casualness that made Clara's blood run cold as representatives of Thaddeus Kane. "Mr. Kane sends his regards," the lead rider said, a lean man with a rifle resting easy across his saddle. The particular ease of a man who used the weapon often enough to have stopped thinking of it as a threat. "And a reminder that this herd was contracted for his purchase come the autumn drive. Seems you folks have taken a wrong turn somewhere heading east stead of toward his spread." "Contract expired," Caleb said, voice hard, his own hand resting near his own weapon without quite touching it. "I paid every dollar owed on that note on time every season since my daddy signed it. Kane's got no legal claim on where I choose to sell my own cattle." "Legal claim." The rider's smile was thin, unpleasant. "Funny thing about legal claims out here, Hargrove. They tend to matter less than who's willing to enforce them. Mr. Kane would consider it a personal courtesy if you'd turn this herd back toward his spread, for anybody has to find out the hard way how serious he is about honoring arrangements." The standoff stretched tense and dangerous. 12 exhausted drovers against 3 armed men, cattle lowing restlessly in the water between them, and Clara felt her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone present could hear it. It was Otis Grady who broke the silence, riding forward with a shotgun cradled loose, but ready across his own saddle, flanked immediately by his 2 sons. "Funny thing about arrangements," Otis said, echoing the rider's own phrase with a coldness that surprised even Clara. "Kane arranged to have me hang for cattle theft I never committed. Arranged to have a drifter lie under oath. I don't much care for Kane's arrangements no more, and I expect these other 11 riders feel similar, given every one of 'em's got their own grievance with the man." He looked around at the assembled drovers, and one by one, hands drifted toward weapons, a silent, unified declaration. "You want to start something here, mister, you're welcome to try, but I'd think hard on whether Kane's paying you enough to die for his cattle contract." The rider's smile faltered, calculation flickering behind his eyes as he did the arithmetic of 3 against 12, the numbers not remotely in his favor. "This ain't over," he said, finally reining his horse back from the crossing. "Kane'll hear about this." "Good," Clara called out, unable to help herself. "Tell him precisely how it went. Tell him honest men outnumbered his hired guns 12-3, and not one of us blinked." The riders retreated and the herd crossed the river without further incident, but Clara understood watching them go that Kane's retaliation had only been delayed, not abandoned, and that whatever came next would likely be worse for having failed once already. They reached Laramie on the 14th day, herd intact, exhausted but triumphant, and the rail agent Caleb dealt with a brisk fairman named Thomas Reeves, who had no stake in Cedar Hollow's politics and no reason to favor Kane's interests, offered a price nearly 40% above what Kane's contract would have paid, $960. Caleb said that evening, staring at the bank draft in his hands like he couldn't quite believe its reality. "Clara, that's enough. That's enough to clear the note whole and have something left besides." I told you it would be, Clara said, though her own relief was so profound it made her knees weak. They celebrated that night with the whole drive crew a modest supper in Laramie's one respectable hotel, laughter and exhaustion, and the particular joy of people who'd faced down real danger together and come out the other side intact. But the celebration was short-lived, because the telegram waiting for Caleb at the hotel desk the following morning carried news that turned triumph to ash in an instant. "It's from Sheriff Hicks," Caleb said, reading it twice, his face draining of color. "Clara, the forge. Someone burned the forge to the ground 3 nights back, and the house—" His voice cracked. "The house is damaged too. Fire spread from the shed 'fore anybody caught it. Nobody hurt, thank God, but—" Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "Kane?" she said, though she scarcely needed to say it. "Can't prove it," Caleb said, echoing words that had become a grim refrain throughout this whole ordeal. "Sheriff says it looks deliberate, but there's no witness, no confession, nothing to tie it direct to Kane's hand." Clara sat down hard on the nearest chair. Her father's forge, twice built, now once by a father she'd lost, and once by her own 2 hands reduced to ash in her absence, and felt something inside her chest crack open in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with grief. "He burned it," she said, voice shaking. "He couldn't beat us honestly, so he burned it." Caleb knelt in front of her, took her hands in both of his own eyes wet in a way she'd never seen from him before. "We'll rebuild it," he said fiercely. "Twice as strong. I promise you that, Clara. Whatever it costs, whatever it takes, we will rebuild what he tried to destroy. And if he burns it again, then we rebuild it again." Caleb's jaw set hard as the iron she worked. "I ain't letting that man win by breaking our spirit. Clara, not after everything we already survived to get this far. He wants a fight. Fine, he's gonna get one. But this time, we don't just defend. This time, we take the fight straight back to him." They returned to Cedar Hollow to find the damage worse than the telegram had conveyed. The forge entirely gutted the tools Clara had used all summer, either melted beyond repair or stolen outright in the chaos, and a corner of the house itself scorched black, where the fire had licked close before neighbors alerted by the smoke had managed to contain it. But it was not despair Clara felt standing in the ashes of what Kane's hired hands had destroyed. It was rage, clean and clarifying as the fire itself. "He thinks this ends it," she said, kicking through the wreckage, finding miraculously her father's hammer half buried in ash, scorched but intact, the one tool that had survived everything: the bank, the journey west, and now this. She lifted it, held it against her chest like a talisman. "He thinks burning a building burns the will along with it." "Does it?" Caleb asked, quietly watching her. Clara turned to him, hammer still clutched tight, something fierce and unbreakable blazing behind her eyes. "No," she said. "It does not. This forge was never really the shed, Caleb. It was never the anvil, or the bellows, or the walls around it. It was this." She raised the hammer, and this. She pressed her free hand flat against her own chest, and neither of those burned. Neither of those will ever burn, not while I've got breath in my body. Word of the fire spread through Cedar Hollow with predictable speed, and this time, remarkably, the story that took hold was not one of scandal or shame, but of outrage. Outrage that someone would burn a woman's livelihood, would destroy tools that had mended half the valley's broken fortunes over one long, difficult summer. Ruth Calloway herself, of all people, arrived at the ranch 3 days later, awkward and unpracticed, in an apology Clara suspected she'd never once offered anyone in her adult life. "I said cruel things," Ruth admitted, standing stiff in the yard, refusing to meet Clara's eyes directly. "About you playing at a man's trade. About your marriage being some kind of joke the whole town ought to laugh at." She swallowed hard. "I didn't mean for it to come to this. Fire. Somebody's whole livelihood burned to nothing. That ain't what I wanted, whatever else I said." "What do you want now, Mrs. Calloway?" Clara asked, not unkindly, but not softening either. "I want to help rebuild it." Ruth said the words clearly, costing her something significant. "My husband's got lumber he ain't using. I got hands same as anybody, even if I never once thought to use 'em for something useful before now. It was not forgiveness exactly that Clara offered in return. The cruelty of that first wedding day still sat too close, too raw for something as simple as forgiveness. But it was acceptance of the offer, practical and clear-eyed, because rebuilding required every willing hand the valley could spare, and pride had never once put a roof back over a ruined forge. "Bring the lumber," Clara said. "We'll put it to good use." Say, the rebuilding became in its own strange way the very proof Clara had wanted to give the valley all along. Not scandal, not shame, but community gathered together around a shared purpose. Families who'd once whispered about a woman's unnatural trade, now hauling lumber and stone alongside her, rebuilding what fire had tried to erase. Dr. Kane arrived on the second day of rebuilding, Garrett trailing behind him, both of them uncharacteristically quiet. "My son told me everything," the doctor said, addressing Clara directly for the first time since he'd forbidden Garrett the forge weeks before. "About the cattle, about what he overheard, and what it cost him in courage to come forward despite my forbidding it." He glanced at his son, something like shame and pride mingling in his weathered face. "I was wrong to keep him from you, Mrs. Hargrove. Wrong to think Smith worked beneath him, when it seems to have taught him more about honesty and courage than years of my own lecturing ever managed." "He's a good boy," Clara said simply. "Brave too in ways that matter more than most. He'd like to keep coming." The doctor's voice was gruff, uncomfortable with vulnerability. "If you'll still have him, not instead of medicine. Alongside it, maybe. Seems a young man can hold more than one trade in his hands if he's willing to work hard enough at both." "He's welcome any time," Clara said, and watched Garrett's face light with a relief that made the whole difficult summer feel for one brief moment entirely worth its cost. They rebuilt the forge in 11 days, stronger and better than before, the whole valley's labor woven into its walls. Otis Grady's timber, Ruth Calloway's reluctant but genuine effort, a dozen other hands that had once hesitated to help and now could not seem to do enough. Clara forged a new set of tools from scrap metal, donated by half the town, her father's surviving hammer serving as the anchor around which everything else took shape. But even as the forge rose from its own ashes, the deeper threat remained unresolved. Kane's note was paid, the herd sold, the immediate crisis of debt averted, but the man himself remained wealthy and vengeful, and entirely unpunished for the fire that had nearly destroyed everything Clara had built. "We can't prove he ordered it," Caleb said the evening the forge's new roof went up, watching the last of the day's volunteers head home in the gathering dusk. "Sheriff Hicks agrees it looks deliberate, but without a confession or a witness, there's no case to bring before the judge." "Then we need a witness," Clara said, "or a confession. And where exactly do you propose we find either?" Clara was quiet a long moment, watching the new forge's chimney silhouetted against the darkening sky, and felt the shape of an idea beginning to form, dangerous, uncertain, but perhaps, if executed carefully, exactly the kind of leverage that might finally bring Thaddeus Kane's long reign of quiet cruelty to an end. "Cyrus Dell," she said slowly. "The drifter who lied about Otis. He's still in town, isn't he? Awaiting his own hearing before the circuit judge. Last I heard, yes. Sheriffs kept him under watch on account of the perjury charge. A man facing prison for one lie told on Kane's behalf." Clara said, the plan sharpening in her mind even as she spoke it. "Might be considerably more willing to tell the truth about a second crime, Caleb, if it meant the difference between a lighter sentence and a harsher one. Men like Dell don't stay loyal to men like Kane out of love. They stay loyal out of fear and money, and both of those loyalties tend to crumble the moment self-preservation offers a better bargain." Caleb studied her, something equal parts admiration and apprehension crossing his face. "You're talking about making a deal with the man who nearly got Otis Grady hanged." "I'm talking about using Kane's own methods against him," Clara said. "He spent this whole summer manufacturing lies and buying loyalty. It's past time somebody showed him those same tools cut both ways." The circuit judge was due to arrive within the week, bringing with him not only Whitcomb's original complaint against Clara, But now Sheriff Hicks had confirmed formal proceedings against Cyrus Dell for perjury, and buried somewhere in that convergence of legal reckonings lay, Clara believed, their last best chance to finally expose Thaddeus Kane for exactly what he was in front of the entire valley, with nowhere left for him to hide. Sheriff Hicks agreed to arrange the meeting, though he made his reservations plain the moment Clara laid out her plan in the small back office of the jailhouse. "You're asking me to let you speak with a man awaiting perjury charges," he said, arms crossed. "On the theory he'll trade one confession for a lighter sentence on another crime altogether. That's a mighty thin thread to hang a case on, Mrs. Hargrove." "It's thinner than we'd like," Clara admitted. "But it's the only thread we've got. Sheriff and the judge arrives in 5 days. After that, whatever chance we have of proving Kane's hand in the fire dies along with the opportunity." Hicks studied her a long moment. Then Caleb, then sighed, the particular sigh of a lawman who'd spent years watching money buy silence in this valley, and had finally grown tired enough of it to risk something himself. 10 minutes, he said, supervised, and I ain't promising he'll say a word worth hearing. Cyrus Dell looked smaller behind bars than he had lounging outside the jailhouse in his ill-fitting new boots, and considerably more frightened. Weeks of confinement had stripped whatever bravado $20 stolen had once bought him, leaving behind a thin, nervous man who flinched when the cell door creaked open. "I got nothing more to say," he muttered, not meeting anyone's eyes. "Already told the sheriff everything I know about the cattle business." "This isn't about the cattle," Clara said, settling onto the stool Hicks had provided close enough to speak low, but not so close as to seem threatening. "This is about a fire, Mr. Dell. My forge. Burned to the ground 3 weeks past, while my husband and I were away on a cattle drive. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say, given everything else that's happened to us this summer?" Dell's eyes flicked up then away again, quick and guilty. "Don't know nothing about no fire." "I think you do," Clara said gently. "I think a man who's already facing prison for one lie told on Kane's behalf might know a great deal about what else Kane's hired hands have been doing this summer. And I think that same man, facing years behind bars, might find his circumstances considerably improved if he had something valuable to trade the judge besides an apology." "Kane'll kill me," Dell whispered, and the fear in his voice was raw, unguarded, more honest than anything he'd said since his arrest. "Man like that don't forgive folks who talk. I seen what he does to folks who cross him. Kane can't kill you from a courtroom in front of the entire valley and the territorial judge," Caleb said, stepping forward. "But if you keep quiet, and the truth comes out anyway, because it will, Dell, one way or another, you'll have thrown away your only chance to trade information for mercy. Prison for perjury is years. Prison for perjury and complicity in arson, should the truth surface without your cooperation, could be considerably longer. Your choice." Dell was silent a long moment, his hands twisting together in his lap, some private calculation playing out behind his frightened eyes. "I didn't set the fire myself," he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "But I heard talk. Men Kane keeps on for special jobs. Heard 'em planning it 2 nights before it happened. Heard Kane's own voice given the order matter of fact, though I never told nobody on account of I was scared he'd have me silenced for good if word got back I'd been listening at doors I oughtn't." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "You heard Kane himself order the fire?" "Heard him plain as I'm hearing you now." Dell looked up, something like desperate hope flickering behind his fear. "I'll swear to it. Before the judge, before God, whatever it takes. If it means the difference between a short sentence and a long one, I'll tell every truth I know." The circuit judge, a stern, silver-haired man named Judge Abernathy, who had ridden the territorial circuit for the better part of 2 decades and had in that time developed an allergy to exactly the kind of manufactured small-town corruption Kane specialized in, arrived in Cedar Hollow 4 days later to a town holding its breath. The proceedings began as scheduled, with Elias Whitcomb's original complaint, unlicensed trade moral disorder, the whole ugly fiction Kane had helped construct weeks before. But Whitcomb himself, standing before the judge in a courtroom packed with the very families whose harvests Clara had saved, seemed to shrink with every passing minute, his complaint sounding thinner and more petty each time he was forced to repeat it aloud. "And you claim Mr. Whitcomb," Judge Abernathy said, peering over his spectacles with the particular weariness of a man who'd heard 1,000 grievances dressed up as principal, "that Mrs. Hargrove's ironwork has caused genuine harm to your business or to the moral fabric of this community." "Well," Whitcomb shifted uncomfortably, "she's taken custom that ought to be mine, Your Honor. Standing to reason a man's got a right to protect his livelihood." "Standing to reason," the judge repeated dryly. "Mr. Whitcomb, I've heard testimony this morning from no fewer than 14 families in this valley, each of whom credits Mrs. Hargrove's work with saving their harvest, their livestock, or their livelihood outright. I confess I struggled to locate the moral disorder in that. Perhaps you might clarify what precisely you find so threatening about competent work performed honestly." The courtroom rippled with something that wasn't quite laughter, but came close enough to make Whitcomb's face flush a deep, humiliated red. "I withdraw the complaint, Your Honor," he muttered finally, unable to meet anyone's eyes, least of all Clara's. It should have ended there, a small satisfying victory, the first crack of daylight after a long dark summer. But Clara had not come to this courtroom merely to defend herself. She had come to finish what Kane had started, and when Judge Abernathy moved to the matter of Cyrus Dell's perjury charge, Clara rose from her seat before Sheriff Hicks had even finished presenting the formal accusation. "Your Honor, if the court will permit it," she said, "I believe Mr. Dell has testimony relevant not only to his own charges, but to a second crime committed against my family this summer. One that I believe implicates a man of considerable standing in this valley." A murmur swept the courtroom. Kane, seated near the front in a suit too fine for a territorial courthouse, went very still, his composure cracking for just a moment before he smoothed it back into place. "This is highly irregular," Kane's lawyer objected, rising quickly. "The court is here to address Mr. Dell's perjury regarding the cattle theft accusation, not to entertain unrelated. The court will decide what's relevant." "Counselor," Judge Abernathy said, not unkindly, but with unmistakable authority. "Mrs. Hargrove, you may proceed. Mr. Dell, you're already under oath. I trust you understand the gravity of what that means." Dell's hands shook visibly as he was sworn back to the stand, his eyes flicking once involuntarily toward Kane, who stared back at him with an expression cold enough to freeze the whole courtroom solid. "Mr. Dell," Clara said, standing before him, now her voice steady, despite the wild hammering of her own heart. 3 weeks ago, my blacksmith forge was burned to the ground while my husband and I were away from our property. Do you have knowledge of who ordered that fire?" The silence stretched unbearable, the whole courtroom holding its breath along with Clara. "I do," Dell said finally, voice cracking. "I heard the order given myself. 2 nights before it happened at Kane's spread out past the North Corral. Heard him tell 2 of his hired men plain as anything to burn the Hargrove forge to the ground before the herd drive returned. Said it was time the woman learned her lesson about stayin' in her place." The courtroom erupted. Kane shot to his feet, face gone white with fury. "This is a lie," he snarled. "This man's already facing prison for 1 perjury, Your Honor, and now he's manufacturing a second falsehood to curry favor with the court. I never gave any such order." "Sit down, Mr. Kane," Judge Abernathy said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You'll have your opportunity to respond in due course. Mr. Dell, continue. What else did you witness?" Dell, having crossed whatever internal threshold had kept him silent for weeks, seemed almost relieved now to let the whole truth spill free. He described the cattle rebranding scheme in detail, the theft that had never been theft at all, the $20 paid for false testimony against Otis Grady, the systematic pattern of leverage and intimidation Kane had used against half the valley's struggling families. He named the hired men who'd carried out the fire. He described, with damning specificity, Kane's own words about the herd contract, about the North Pasture note, about wanting the Hargrove land badly enough to burn a woman's livelihood to get it. "You understand," Judge Abernathy said when Dell finally fell silent, "that this testimony, if substantiated, implicates Mr. Kane in arson fraud and witness tampering crimes considerably more serious than the perjury you're currently facing." "I understand it, Your Honor," Dell said, and for the first time since Clara had met him, something like genuine remorse crossed his weathered face. "I done wrong testifyin' false against an honest man. I aim to make what amends I can, even if it means tellin' truths that'll cost me plenty besides." So, what followed was not swift legal proceedings rarely are, but it was thorough. Judge Abernathy, clearly unwilling to let a man of Cain's wealth simply buy his way past a credible accusation, ordered a formal investigation calling witness after witness over the following 2 days. Sarah Pruitt testified to her family's leased land and the pattern of quiet foreclosures Cain had orchestrated across the valley. Garrett Cain, steady and composed despite his youth, repeated under oath exactly what he'd overheard near the North Corral about the cattle rebranding scheme. Even Ruth Calloway, in a moment that seemed to cost her considerable pride, testified that Cain had approached her weeks earlier, asking her to spread specific rumors about Clara's character. Rumors, she admitted, that had originated not from genuine town gossip, but from Cain's own careful, deliberate instruction. "He told me what to say," Ruth admitted, staring at her hands rather than at Cain's furious glare from across the courtroom. "Told me it'd help protect the valley's good order. He said if folks understood a woman workin' iron reflected poorly on her husband's judgment. I didn't think to question why a cattle buyer cared so much about one rancher's household arrangements. I see now I ought to have." By the third day, the weight of testimony had grown too heavy for even Cain's expensive lawyer to deflect entirely. The judge reviewing bank records subpoenaed from the territorial capital confirmed what Clara had suspected. From the very beginning, a pattern stretching back years of manufactured debts, inflated notes, and quiet systematic land acquisition that had cost a dozen families across Cedar Hollow their homes and livelihoods, all while Cain maintained the polished, charming public face of a respectable businessman. Thaddeus Cain, Judge Abernathy said on the fourth and final day of proceedings, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man about to render judgment that would reshape an entire community. "This court finds sufficient evidence to charge you with arson, fraud, witness tampering, and a pattern of predatory financial conduct that has caused demonstrable harm to numerous families within this valley. You will be remanded to territorial custody pending trial at the District Court in Cheyenne, where I have no doubt the full weight of these charges will be examined in considerably greater detail than this circuit court is equipped to provide." Cain's composure finally completely shattered. "This is absurd," he shouted, as the sheriff's deputies moved to escort him from the courtroom. "You're taking the word of a blacksmith's daughter and a lying drifter over a man who's built half the commerce in this territory. I'm taking the word of 14 honest families," Judge Abernathy said, unmoved, "over the word of a man who apparently believed his wealth placed him beyond the reach of consequence. I'd suggest you reconsider that belief, Mr. Cain, on your journey to Cheyenne." The courtroom erupted into a commotion that took Sheriff Hicks several minutes to settle, and through it all, Clara stood very still, her hand tight in Caleb's. Watching the man who had burned her forge, and threatened her husband's land, and manufactured a false crime against an innocent farmer, finally completely undone by nothing more than the accumulated truth of everyone he'd wronged, finally brave enough to speak. The valley changed in the weeks that followed, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way a long winter finally breaks into spring. With Cain's arrest and the exposure of his fraudulent notes, a territorial commissioner arrived within the month to review every outstanding debt Cain had held across Cedar Hollow, and family after family found their inflated predatory notes reduced to fair, honest terms, or in several cases forgiven outright where fraud could be clearly demonstrated. The Pruitt family's lease was restored to its original sustainable rate. Otis Grady, still shaken from his weeks in jail, but steadily recovering his old good humor, found himself something of a local hero. His story of near hanging and eventual vindication told and retold at every gathering the valley held that autumn, and the forge rebuilt stronger than before, its walls raised by the very neighbors who'd once whispered about the strangeness of a woman's hammer, became something Clara could never have imagined on that first bewildering day she'd stepped off the stagecoach into Caleb Hargrove's uncertain welcome. It became the heart of Cedar Hollow. Families came not in secret anymore, not under cover of dusk, with careful requests for silence. but openly proudly bringing broken tools and bent hinges and cracked wagon wheels, trusting Clara's hands, the way they'd once trusted no woman's hands, to do anything beyond needlework and biscuit dough. Elias Whitcomb, humbled by the whole ordeal, and considerably less prosperous now that half his old customers had quietly redirected their business, eventually approached Clara with an offer she hadn't expected. "I was wrong about you," he said, standing awkward in the forge doorway one crisp October morning, hat twisted in his hands. "Wrong to think a woman's hands couldn't do honest work same as a man's. I got more custom than I can handle some weeks, and you clearly got more skill than this whole valley knows what to do with. Wondered if you'd consider, well, working together maybe, splitting custom fare, teaching each other what we each do best." Clara studied him a long moment, remembering the ugly complaint that had nearly cost her everything, the public humiliation, the fear that had shadowed those early weeks. But she remembered, too, the particular grace of a man honest enough to admit his own wrongness aloud in front of the very people he'd once tried to turn against her. "I'd consider it," she said finally. "Provided you understand, Mr. Whitcomb, that whatever we build together, my hands are never again going to be treated as lesser than any man's in this valley. Not yours, not anyone's." "Wouldn't dream of it, ma'am," Whitcomb said, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Cedar Hollow, he extended his hand to her, not in courtesy, but in genuine partnership. "Reckon this whole valley's learned that lesson plain enough this summer." So, Garrett Kane, no relation. The boy still insisted, laughing now, instead of flushing with embarrassment when he said it became a fixture at the forge that autumn. Splitting his afternoons between his father's medical apprenticeship and the patient work of learning iron under Clara's careful instruction, and Dr. Kane himself, once so fiercely opposed to his son's divided interests, took to stopping by some evenings just to watch something like quiet pride settling into his tired, kind face. "Boy's got a gift for both trades," the doctor admitted to Clara one such evening, watching Garrett work a piece of scrap metal with growing confidence. "Took me too long to see it. Took this whole summer matter of fact and a good deal of stubbornness on his part to prove me wrong. Sometimes that's exactly what it takes," Clara said, thinking of her own father of the forge she'd lost and rebuilt twice over now, of every person in her life who'd needed proof before they'd offer belief. Stubbornness and time, and someone brave enough to keep showing up despite being told they don't belong. Caleb found her that evening in the forge, banking the fire low for the night, the way she always did. Her movements sure and practiced now, in a way that felt less like a skill she'd learned and more like a truth she'd simply been waiting her whole life to claim. "Judge's letter came today," he said, holding up an envelope she recognized immediately. "Kane's trial's set for spring down in Cheyenne. Prosecutor says the evidence against him's about as solid as evidence gets. Man's not walking away from this one, Clara. Not with his money, not with his charm, not with anything." Clara set down her hammer and crossed to him, feeling the particular warmth of relief settle deep into her bones. Not triumph exactly, though there was triumph in it too, but something steadier. Peace, maybe. The particular peace of a fight finally truly won. "And the ranch?" she asked. The note. "Cleared in full," Caleb said, and there was wonder in his voice even now, weeks after the herd sale had settled the debt entirely. "Cleared and with enough left over that I been thinking—" He hesitated, something almost shy crossing his weathered face. "Been thinking we might expand the house a bit. Add a proper room for the forge tools, 'stead of you hauling everything back and forth from the shed. And maybe—" He stopped again, cleared his throat. "Maybe what?" Clara pressed something warm blooming in her chest at his sudden uncertainty. "Maybe a nursery," Caleb said, quiet, watching her face carefully for her reaction. "Someday, not rushing you into nothing. Clara, I know we started this marriage strange, ordered out of a catalog same as a plow blade, and I know it took us both a good while to figure what we actually wanted out of it. But I find myself wanting more now. Wanting a whole life with you, not just a arrangement that keeps us both fed and the ranch running. Wanting children who grow up watching their mother forge iron with the same pride most children watch their fathers ride fence. Clara felt her throat tighten, tears rising unexpected and unashamed. "I want that too," she said softly. "I didn't know how much until just now hearing you say it. But I want that, Caleb. All of it. The house, the family, the whole life neither one of us ordered from any catalog, but built instead together out of nothing but stubbornness and iron and whatever this is that's grown between us." He kissed her, then gentle and sure. The forge fire glowing low and warm around them, and outside the last light of an October evening, settled soft over a valley that had, in one long difficult summer, learned something it would not soon forget: that strength wore many faces, that courage sometimes arrived disguised as a woman with soot on her hands and a hammer that refused to stay silent, and that the truest measure of a person was never the trade they'd been born to, but the fierce, unyielding grace with which they chose to wield it. Clara Hargrove stood in the forge her father had taught her to love, and her husband had learned to cherish, surrounded by a valley that had finally fully claimed her as one of its own, and understood with a certainty that settled deep and permanent into her bones, that she had never once needed a parlor with a pretty window to find the life she'd always been meant to live. She had only ever needed fire and iron and the courage to keep striking true until the whole world learned to listen.